Well, thank you all so much for being here today. I'm really honored that Sam and Cornelia reached out to me. As I will talk about later in the presentation, I left the mycology world for a bit to explore my interest with wildfire and have since returned. And I'm really excited to talk about my background and my research, but also now that Trad is here, and as well as all of you being here with your interest and curiosity in mycology, mycoremediation, where you are seeing the field now and where you see opportunities for me as well as I'm re-entering it. So I titled my presentation today, Mycofiltration and Mushroom Mania, because I really found, since I've been exploring mycology, that this fervent pop culture movement around mushrooms, or mushrooms on everything from dish towels to jewelry to films, has really brought up this great stamina and idea in grant writing and granting facilities, in the sense that academia, I think Chad was kind of mentioning this before, but hasn't really caught up yet with this mushroom mania and giving grants for this kind of academic research, but these other grant facilities have. And with that, I'll be talking about the grants I've had and what I'm looking forward to in these next steps. So this is just a photograph from my time in Nepal, which I'll be talking about later. But I wanted to start with, let's make sure the screen is, my screen is not changing. I wonder if I should, sorry, pause. I'll be right back. I'm going to try to share a different one because this isn't working there. Okay, here we go. Okay, great. I wanted to start with where I'm from. I'm from Swan Valley, Montana. It's a rural 300-person town in western Montana, nestled between, here on the left, we see the Mission Mountain Wilderness, and here on the right, the Bob Marshall Wilderness. And this is a town in an area that frequently experiences wildfire and is part of the crown of the continent ecosystem. So a very well-known, intact hotspot for biodiversity in North America. And because it's so intact, it experiences wildfire in a way that the question constantly is, can we let it burn and have this idea of management, or do we need to suppress it because there are human values that live among these ecosystems? So here is where I grew up specifically. This is my house. And if you drive 3.5 miles across the highway, you reach the wildland firefighting facility. So seasonally, growing up in the Swan Valley, I would always see every summer the wildland firefighters come through. And every summer, almost, we had wildfire. So there were all this, this media and talk around battling wildfire, fire here, stay safe. Now we're getting podcasts around wildfire. And there were always these community meetings that were quite heated in the summers around how we think about and manage wildfire. A town of 310 can have a really incredible diversity of thought. And that is really distilled into, how do we relate to our environments? How do we think about how we're part of them versus control them? And wildfire was just constantly in our thoughts about the summers and about how we, again, relate to the environments in these areas. I just wanted to pitch also, there was a recent podcast that came out with Montana PR called Fireline, where I had the honor of being part of it, but really just talking about the issue of wildfire, in the sense that wildfire in itself is not an issue, but it is in how it affects human lives and communities. So just want to talk a little bit more about where I grew up. This is the 4th of July. Every year, it's the biggest day of the year. It's where our community elders, such as Neil and Dixie Meyer, come out and talk about the history of logging in Condon, or Condon is the name of the town within the Swan Valley. And so logging really has a deep history in this area. Of course, it was originally lived on and taken care of by the Salish Kootenai tribe. And then it was when the white folks came in and started really being part of the timber industry, that really formed this kind of root culture around the forested areas in which we live. And also, these ideas of how we relate to the wild and wilderness. We have, these companies that bring out people into the Bob Marshall with their pack trains and such. And we have the environmentalists and the recovering loggers in the area, since logging really has been taken out of the area since Plum Creek sold all of its land to the Montana Legacy Project for the purposes of conservation. And I'm just wondering, can any of you tell who in these pictures are the environmentalists versus the post loggers? Well, then you're definitely from the East Coast. I mean, like, come on, there's the Bud Light, there's the, no, I'm kidding. No, what really is hard to tell, because conservation has been influenced by the logging industry in this area. And with that, again, it's influenced how we think about our relationship to wildfire. Wildfire can be very emotional. We see trees falling down, we see blackened forests, we see people coming in with their chainsaws to take care of it, and smoke everywhere, and it feels apocalyptic. And then the spring comes, and morels come, and they're the first organism to come back to these fire-ravaged areas after the wildfire season. And there's this collective response in the Swan where all of this conflict and different opinions on how we need to manage or suppress wildfire are kind of just put to the side for at least a little bit to go and collect morels. So there's excitement around morel season. There's this collective healing from fear and conflict around wildfire, and there's morels, and there are more morels. And with that, I went to my undergraduate degree, and our undergraduate college, I should say, in Portland, Luce and Clarke College. It was just this deep relationship with wildfire and how it affected community and ecosystem processes. And at the time, most of the students at Luce and Clarke had not experienced wildfire. They were from Portland, they were from the Bay Area. And back in 2011 to 2015, we were not seeing the severe wildfires in those areas that we're seeing now. So it was a bit of an enigma for me to talk about wildfire and all the processes that came with it. And while I was at college, I was supporting myself through, and this is how I started really practicing and submitting grant and scholarship proposals to facilitate that. And I connected with Dr. Peter Kennedy, who was a local mycologist at Luce and Clarke College and one of my mentors. And the Presidential Scholarship for Academic Engagement came up at Luce and Clarke, and for that, you had to submit a grant proposal. So I went and spoke with Dr. Kennedy and said I wanted to apply for this, but I didn't know what I wanted to study. And he asked me, what is an organism that you really connect with? And I said, well, of course, the morel. So he gave me this book, and it's called Ecology and Management of Morels Harvested from the Forests of Western North America. It's a Forest Service published book. And I was reading it and trying to kind of just explore what I could study with morels. And I came across this line that read something along the lines of, fire morels have never been studied for their mycorrhizal potential. And this was my Lucy and Charlie Brown, like, that's it moment. That's exactly what I want to be studying. That's what I want to look into. How are fire morels contributing to post-fire environments? What are their life strategies? What are they doing for the environment, both in recycling of nutrients and in regeneration? And so I got the Presidential Scholarship and was able to return to the Swan Valley that following summer. And this is a picture of a few years later from the Condon Mountain Fire. Now, the Condon Mountain Fire burned less than 1.5 miles from my home, and it was a very emotional experience for all of us to know that this wildfire was so close and what that meant for us. And then with this grant, I was able to return into these slopes that were just blooming with fire morels and be able to start studying, what are they doing there? How are they possibly contributing to regeneration? Because honestly, we know very little about how post-fire morels reproduce, how they come back to an environment post-fire, were they already there? And so I was able to acquire a few wonderful mentors along the way, one of those being Larry Evans, you may know of him from Missoula, and Tim Wheeler, who's really I would say, profound mycologist and lichenologist here out of Missoula. So I traveled around the Northern Rockies in both the Swan Valley and Idaho, collecting environmental samples, which included soil, the mushroom samples, the ascocarps and stipes, and tree samples, barks and needles. And I was collecting these environmental samples so that I could conduct a isotopic analysis. So Dr. Kennedy left, Dr. Margaret Metz became my new mentor at Lewis and Clarke. And for a senior independent study, I studied how isotopic analysis can be used to infer the mycorrhizal potential of fire morel mushrooms. So isotopic analysis is a technique developed by Dr. Eric Hobby out of the University of New Hampshire. And it really is an inference tool. It's a way of looking at ratios and relative amounts of nitrogen 15 to nitrogen 14 and carbon 13 to carbon 12, so the different protons that come with those minerals, and seeing how those ratios are found as patterns in different mycorrhizal versus saprotrophic mushrooms, and how we can use those patterns to infer if mushrooms are likely mycorrhizal or saprotrophic. So some of you are new to this club, and sounds like there's plenty of advanced people in it as well, but I'll just take a moment to explain mycorrhizal versus saprotrophic. So saprotrophic are the decomposers. They're the ones that are on the dead trees and dead logs in areas, decomposing the already dead organic nutrients and back into the soil. And then the mycorrhizal are the symbionts to local herbaceous species. So those could be to trees or other plants in the area. And they are forming symbiotic relationships with those plants, and kind of the idea of giving these plants these nutrients that, because mushrooms have a lot of surface area from their mycelium or their root system, they're able to gather nutrients that are hard for plants to obtain, namely nitrogen, and pass those nutrients on to their mycorrhizal symbionts. And because mushrooms cannot fix carbon, their associates, their plant associates, can pass their fixed carbon back into the mushroom, and then that's how they survive as well. So to say, I must say that both would contribute to forestry regeneration, whether it was mycorrhizal or symbiotic for these post-fire morels, because saprotrophic mushrooms are indirectly contributing to regeneration by decomposing, by releasing more nutrients into the soil that can be used by other plants that are growing. Or if they're mycorrhizal, they're directly involved with these plants returning or surviving in these post-fire landscapes. So with these environmental samples, I sent them to the UC Davis Stable Isotope Facility to analyze their isotopic ratios. And this is just what I'll share from that study. So for the nitrogen 15 and carbon 13, we find that there's the relative amounts of the mushroom to local tree species is that mushrooms tend to be enriched in nitrogen 15 and carbon 13 compared to trees that they have a mycorrhizal symbiosis with. So here we can see that the morel is enriched in nitrogen 15 compared to all of these other tree species. This includes subalpine fir and lodgepole pine and larch, but it's not enriched in nitrogen 15 compared to the ponderosa pine. It is enriched in carbon 13 compared to all of them. And from this inference, I was able to suggest that post-fire morels are mycorrhizal in their life strategy. So they're sharing these symbiotic relationships with these local trees and could be possibly allowing them to survive post-wildfire. Now, I submitted my independent study in 2015, and funny enough, the same year, Dr. Eric Hobby, who created this isotopic inference tool, also published a study on post-fire morels and their mycorrhizal versus saprotrophic potential. And Dr. Hobby found that post-fire morels found in Oregon and Alaska, he thinks, are actually saprotrophic. And this, of course, is different from my findings. And I have three suggestions of why this could be. One is that the Morchella genus is a highly debated genus for which species exist versus don't. And we can agree that the post-fire morels are part of the Morchella esculenta black clades. So they're the yellow, white, and black clade that we usually talk about. But within that clade, there are so many species that we are just not sure which is which, that it could be that Dr. Hobby and I were looking at different post-fire morel species. Another idea is that, I never published my study. And one of the reasons was I can think about so many things I would have done differently. And one of them would have been to dig deeper into the soil for my samples to try to match the way that Dr. Hobby collected his bark samples better. It could be that our environmental samples were different enough that the inferences we were gaining were just off kilter with one another. The final, most exciting possibility that I think these differences could indicate is that post-fire morels are able to adapt to the local environment and in that way become saprotrophic or mycorrhizal as a life strategy depending on the environmental conditions. So this could possibly mean depending on the severity of the wildfire, how many trees or plants have survived, or is it a mosaic pattern where they can find food sources nearby or other symbionts to match with? Or is it a high severity fire where there's mass die-off of these trees? And from that, morels are able to switch to saprotrophy versus mycorrhizal. And these are just ideas. I mean, what are fire morels doing there in the first place? Why are we only seeing them post-fire? That also could be because post-fire we see a release of nutrients and there's less competition, and post-fire morels are able to capitalize on that and reproduce. It could be that they're mycorrhizal and it's a last chance where their host species have died and they're just reproducing at large rates. There's still so many questions to be answered from post-fire morels and to see how that might influence how we think about morel harvesting and post-fire landscapes in general. So during this time, when I was at Lewis and Clarke, I wrote to Dr. Francois Busquot because he had established quite a few morel papers from the 1980s and 90s. And many of his experiments were exploring, can morels form symbiotic relationships? And these were mostly in controlled environments, but I found them fascinating and inspiring for my work. So I just reached out to him and told him about what I was doing and why I was interested in his work. And just from our correspondence, he actually offered me a guest scientist position at the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research. So the spring after I graduated from Lewis and Clarke, I went to Halle, Germany. And this is where I worked with Dr. Francois Busquot and also found that just because you become a big name scientist in a certain sense doesn't mean that anyone will be there to help you. And I stumbled quite a bit. I had to figure out in a very hard way that the American way of being really curious and voicing questions and concerns is not how people talk or learn or teach in Germany. And I also had to just figure out the ways of the lab on my own. And I had to also find ways to get around Germany. And thankfully, I had a partner in crime through all of this, Dr. Peter Otto. He is a professor at the University of Leipzig. And Peter was the one who drove me all over the German countryside looking for morels. And I remember one day specifically where we got out at about 11 to this gorgeous area and it was sunny and we were looking around, we weren't finding any morels. And Peter said, Lily, maybe we're not finding the morels because they know we're not drinking beer. And I said, yeah. So, we started at 11 a.m. and lo and behold, we never found morels. We did have a great day. So I thank Peter for being very available for me through that time. And I did write a paper and I did send this to Dr. Francois Busquot. But let me just say right now that this was a very unpublishable study. It's something that I look back on and I remember how few resources I had And what I did with that was a study that I can now describe as quite silly, but I understand why I did it. So I would go around and dig up Morel stipes, and I was really curious as I was looking at how all of these herbaceous roots and plants were globbing on to the bases of the morels, and just really wondering, is this because, again, the morel roots, the mycelium, are able to gather up all of these nutrients that the plants really want? Is it just by chance that this is a dense herbaceous area and the plant roots are growing really close to the mushrooms? But I use these mushrooms and these samples to then look at the PCR, so genetic analysis, to see, is it possible that from the morel DNA, we can look and see if we find plant DNA within that of which we study of the morel, and therefore they're forming a mycorrhizal association. The reason that this study is not worth talking deeply about is because, of course, there was genetic contamination from the plants that were surrounding the morel. And if you found some plant DNA material within that of the morel, it didn't at all mean that they were bonding. It also could just mean that they were growing next to each other. So a big learning experience. And when I was done there, I was able to go back home to Montana for 3 weeks and, really just kind of reflect on my time with Dr. Busco, and then get ready to go on my Fulbright in Nepal. So when I got my Fulbright, I was so excited, and I wrote this, and it's very grammatically incorrect. It says I got Fulbright, but I've learned since a proper grammar for such a thing. And I got to Nepal, and I knew I was going to be there for a year, and they said they could create name cards for us, and I called myself a mycologist. And I remember my grandma asking me, like, "Oh, are you an IST now?" I was like, "You know what, Grandma, I don't know, but I'm going to put it on my business card." So I did, and this is what it looked like. And I had some really incredible mentors during my year in Nepal. Dr. Bharat Babu Shrestha was my main advisor for Fulbright, and he's actually an invasive species scientist, but was really instrumental in connecting me with other mycologists in Nepal, including Dr. Shiva Devkota. I would say he really should be on the periphery of everyone here. He's doing really phenomenal work, really studying and also identifying, the current 228 edible fungal species in Nepal, and doing a lot of work with the cordyceps, which is a huge economic and cultural factor in Nepal. This also called Himalayan Viagra, for why it's sold to China. And so Dr. Devkota was able to connect me with many communities and mentors as well, including Dr. Reshma Tuladhar, who is a biochemist in Nepal, who was able to mentor me in some of my studies with the mycofilter, which I will talk about in a little bit. So as my graduate school advisor later said, everyone thinks that they are an amateur social scientist, which is exactly what I was doing in Nepal for my first project. I came there, I was really interested in how people relate to mushrooms, because I was there as per suggestion of an anthropology teacher from Lewis and Clarke, Dr. Kabir Heimsath, who had told me that Nepal heavily integrates mushrooms into diets, into medicinal purposes, into just cultural practices. And I wanted to learn more about all of these, different ways people relate to mushrooms in Nepal. So I did my amateur social scientist study along central Nepal's elevation gradient. So starting in the Terai, which is along India's border, 183 meters above sea level, so very hot, where all the banana trees grow. And then up into the mid-hills, Dampus, 1,700 meters above sea level. And this is a really lush, wet, just really incredible area for biodiversity. And then up into Manang, into the Himalayan region, much more temperate. And I was with a translator for this study and was able to talk with about 53 different people throughout this elevation gradient with her, as she was my translator. And since this is the Mushroom Club, I wanted to share some of the mushrooms that I learned about and came upon during my time there. And to also say, mushroom taxonomy is not my strong suit. And I certainly tried my best to identify some of the species. But if you have any ideas or corrections for my ideas, I would really appreciate hearing them. So I'll start here with the Duli chow. That means that termite mushroom. Chow means mushroom in Nepali. Shao means apple. And if you are a white American English speaker like me, they sound very similar. So people often thought I was studying apples and had to go into the reasoning why I was in fact studying mushrooms. And so the Duli chow is a mushroom that grows out of termite mounds and is in fact cultivated by termites to feed their young. And this is highly sought after as a protein and food source in the Terai region, which of course can make it very difficult for the termites to grow these back. They have to destroy the entire mound to get to these mushrooms. Now, this is a mushroom also in the Terai region. I identified it as Ganoderma lingzi because it doesn't have a highly lacquered finish to be what we would generally think of as reishi. And the Chepang in the area is highly valued by Chinese medicine, but they don't use it, which to me could also mean, well, it looks like reishi or it is in fact used in Chinese medicine. And if any of you have a better idea than me, again, of what this is, I would appreciate the help with that. And then there's the Dasai Chow. Dasai is a huge festival in Nepal every fall, and it's called Dasai just because these chanterelles grow during that time. It's a festival of a certain goddess in Hindu religion. It's also called Kupurafule Chow, which means chicken meat chow, because they say it tastes like, it's highly valued for its flavor. Local Chepang women were very excited when they found it. And I should say that Nepal still has the caste system. And with that, many of the people I was learning from were indigenous groups and of the lowest caste system. And so they were those who knew the land very well from their ancestral history there and still passed on that knowledge, and also lived in deep poverty. And part of the harvesting of wild mushrooms was because it was such a substantial food source for them. So just to take out any of the kind of mythology with it, it was also for survival. So moving up into the mid hills, here is a Katne chow, which of course is a turkey tail. Katne means wood in Nepali. And this was not used for food or medicine, but it was used to plug up the wooden pots in the areas to just just to repair. I just found that really interesting because it's not, maybe just because I don't use wooden pots a lot, I wouldn't have thought that. And this is the Chate Chow umbrella mushroom. I would love if someone had an idea of what this is, because it was so highly valued in the area for food. People loved to talk about how they would drink rakshi, the local brew, and grill this with salt and pepper. There were so many names for it. One was forget now in Nepali, but one was for earth, and one was snake, because they say if the snake so there's past this mushroom, it might become poisonous. So this Chate Chow was just a really beautiful one. And moving up into the Himalayas, these are the Kali chow, so cauliflower, and in English, they're considered the coral mushrooms. They're not, at least in Nepal, weren't used for food. And this is the Fokso chow, which means lung, and it's edible, though not highly sought after. And I think it's probably of the Bolita species, which, here is highly sought after for food source, but again, not 100%. And then there are other mushrooms that they didn't have names for. And I think about, our LBO, the little brown ones, who we see all the time, but we can't identify what species they are. And this one was just a really interesting one to me with how it bruised blue and was likely not edible from that. And then finally, the mushroom I wanted to share was the Ruffatto chow, the red mushroom. And this is also found in the Himalayan region. Absolutely delicious, super meaty and thick. And I still salivate thinking about this mushroom, and this was a species I thought it might be, but again, suggestions will be taken. So from my amateur social scientist study, I just wanted to briefly share some of the results I found, and there was a lot of conversation in these areas around mushroom populations decreasing, not in the Himalayas, but in the Terai and mid-hill regions. And quite a few folks were talking about how they thought more people were collecting wild edible mushrooms. And that could just be from population increase, that could be from ebbs and flows in climate, that could be a lot of things, but it's something that, of course, would need to be matched with some scientific exploration just to see if local perspectives were in line what scientists like to think is right, at least. So anyway, from all of this, I really was just able to see how mushrooms are used as medicine and food and utility in these different communities in Nepal. And I wanted to save this, but was so excited to find morels there. And so morels are known as Gucci chow, which Gucci is just kind of describes their look, their ridges and forms. And I had returned to the Himalayas later in my time, during my time in FULBRIGHT, because I knew it was morel season. And of course I had to be there, and I was led by a good friend of mine I had made while studying the region earlier on. And so we would go to different households, his village and others, and just talk with folks about their value of morels. And was so interesting is morel is really valued as medicine in this Manang region, and I'm sorry, in this Annapurna region. And they're not used for food. They're highly expensive if they're sent to China for economy, and really coveted by a lot of local families. You know, some will talk about how they treat the stomach, some will talk about how they treat the heart or cancer or the skin. And finally, we were drinking the local brew Roxy in this right picture. And one of the guys just described it like this, like morels treat the entire body. And I just found that so interesting because I had been collecting morels my entire life and had just thought about they're great with butter, and that was it, you know? And so it was really a wonderful time to learn and be around morels and see post-fire areas with morels. And when I was leaving the Himalayan region, I actually got to speak with a local Ayurvedic doctor, and he described morels as being the most highly valued medicinal plants in the area. So again, just to emphasize, morels are used as medicine in this region, and I can't say much beyond that, but still have a great curiosity from those teachings. So after this time of studying, ethnomycology in central Nepal, I returned to the Terai region. I had met Mama. Mama means uncle in Nepali, who was just this really wonderful gentleman, and his family owned and operated this oyster mushroom farm in the Terai region. And this area of Padampur was known as the central oyster mushroom growing town in the entire Terai region because of Mama. Mama started his farm and then started training other people in the area, including women, which Nepal is still quite a patriarchal society. It must be clear, so it's the US. But he started teaching all these women and men and their families how to grow oyster mushrooms, and it became a staple of the diet in the area. So this was my time of living on a mushroom farm and really becoming immersed in these ideas in how to cultivate, but also just immersed in Nepali. I wasn't with a translator anymore. I was there on my own and really learning how to connect and stumbling a lot with what I was saying and what I thought people were saying. And was really able to connect with Naveen, especially. He was kind of considered the houseboy and home where I was living with a host family. And he loved to draw mushrooms, and we would go on all these adventures together. And on Christmas, I insisted that we bring a chicken home to his family. And in Nepali, I had insisted we bring a kukura chicken home, but because I didn't say kukura masu, chicken meat, we end up bringing a whole darling chicken to his place. So it really was a special time for me to bond with folks and to have a name besides just being a white woman in the area studying mushrooms for some reason. And during my time in the Terai region, I really started getting interested in mycofiltration because I saw how there were local filtration systems that were really a cylinder with sand to gravel. I'm just thinking about how there was all this potential behind the filtration capabilities of oyster mushrooms. Nepal experiences a lot of water contamination, especially in the monsoon season when there's a ton of flooding. A lot of Salmonella, E. coli, among other things, enter the drinking water system. So I just wanted to start experimenting and seeing if, in fact, the mycofilter could contribute to clean water in the area. And the first big issue that I honestly still haven't solved is that the water came out orange. And quite frankly, I won't be drinking orange water. But trying to move beyond that and actually testing the mycofilter efficacy was something I started exploring in labs in Kathmandu and the Terai area. Now, these labs were great facilities where I got to look at the water that had the Salmonella and E. coli and run them through 4 months mycelium versus the straw control for 5, 10, and 30 minutes. But the labs also lost either electricity or water every day, rendering my study quite useless. And so because of that, I just tried to take some hipster photos of my Petri dishes, but even that didn't turn out that great. And then I got these, ink blots that if any of you can talk to me about what those mean, great. But all of this to say is great pilot study and that it inspired curiosity, but certainly no results came of this. So I finished my Fulbright. I had a great time saying goodbye to Bharat, sir. And then I returned to the US and I became a dirty wildland firefighter for 4 seasons. This is me just last season on the 25-mile fire outside of Chelan, Washington. It was really a time for me to revisit my connection with wildfire, which was why I first became interested in morels. And to contribute to my community back in the Swan Valley. I was on the wildland fire crew there for 3 seasons and then in Bend, Oregon this past season. And yeah, a time to learn about wildfire on the ground. I mean, for these 3 years, I also enjoyed a photography show for my time in Nepal. I also did a master's thesis. And this is when I actually became a social scientist, because I did my master's on social science in the sense of how wildfire can serve as a catalyst for community level resilience. And so I'm in my master program. It's the second year of the 2-year program. And the John Ruffatto Business Startup Challenge becomes advertised. And my mom had been reading about this challenge about a year before and insisted that I apply for it. And I, frankly told her that, Mom, I have absolutely no experience in business. And she insisted that I apply. So I reached out to Paul Gladen, who was the Blackstone Launchpad leader and still is, and started talking with him about my interest and my background in mycology and how I thought, what I wanted to do with that. And Paul insisted that I could make a business out of it. And I kept kind of being like, well, Paul, I don't know anything about business. And so he started meeting with me every 2 weeks. And so I applied. I mean, I was just doing my master's thesis. What a perfect time to start a venture. And Morel LLC proposed that we use oyster mushroom mycelium to treat brewery wastewater. Craft beer is one of the main cultural and economic icons of Montana. A lot of tourists come here. What makes us survive our winters. And there have been studies show that oyster mushroom mycelium can treat brewery wastewater. Brewery wastewater is a huge economic toll on local municipal water systems. It's a headache for rural areas to bring that brewery wastewater to other water systems where it can be treated. So it was a great idea. I won the competition and I was able to establish Morel LLC. So after all of the fervor of that, there's kind of this slate of like, oh, do I want to make my life about treating brewery wastewater? So then came the Festival of Urgent Reinventions, for which I know Sam and Cornelia advertised. It starts tomorrow and Friday. An absolutely fantastic festival. Even if you can just join for a little bit, it has really incredible speakers. And while watching this, I saw that Rodrigo Garcia Gonzalez was speaking. And years ago, my mom had shown me this YouTube video of Rodrigo. He established OHA, which is this company that has made it so that you can drink water out of algal pods, and specifically seaweed. And these allow you to not drink water out of plastic water bottles. They can be eaten, they can be thrown to the side of the marathon course. And I was just so enthralled that he was speaking. And then there was a chance to apply for a grant. And I was, okay, I'll apply for the grant. It was due the next day, big deal, you know. And the grant idea for me was around reducing plastic pollution. And I was just thinking, you know, well, why do we create plastic pollution? It's not something that as many people think about with science. If only people knew, then they would just change, which we know is not true in any sense. And so with my idea, I was thinking about how going back to clean drinking water and how a lot of the world didn't have access to safe drinking water. And because of that, people will drink water out of bottled water bottles, and then they will throw away those plastic bottles, which further pollutes their water sources, and they just keep cycling through. And the idea I proposed was, what if we could create mushroom farms with a closed system so that the mushroom farms are creating food sovereignty and security, while also allowing the mycelium to then be used for the mycofiltration system that can then allow access to clean drinking water. And I wrote this in less than 2 hours, and my mom, who's my main editor, asked me if I wanted her to edit it. And I said, no, there's so many people with great ideas. And another friend asked me, I was like, no, really, this is not a big deal. Whatever, I'm not going to get this. This is such a fantastic festival. And lo and behold, I got it the next week. And that was something. So this does contribute to my life cause, in the sense that, what is my life cause? A big part of that is working with the people that I've learned from in Tanzania and Nepal and Zimbabwe, and supporting and continuing to learn from them. So through this whole thing, Rodrigo reached out to me, wanted to become a mentor. I drank a lot of wine and celebrated, and then decided it was time to get to work. And so I reconnected with the women that I lived and worked with in Tanzania on a study abroad program, and in Zimbabwe on a grant where I was studying the African Imbira. And it was really just a practice of facilitating the incredible creativity that comes in areas where if you just gave them the money, they can do really amazing things. And granted, we also have already established trust from all of our years of contact. So Mama Maggie here on the right, here she is in Tanzania with one of her partners in the Women Collective Mushroom Farm that they started there. This is in Zimbabwe. This is their mushroom home that they created. And this is on the right, Martha, one of my main mentors there. And really the idea is trust is already there between these women and I, and these women are also leaders in these communities. And if they can create the cultural context where mushrooms are part of the everyday, mushrooms are part of the diet, they're part of what people talk about, they're part of the economic industry, then if a mycofilter is created and is a success, it can more easily be welcomed. And I should be clear that oyster mushrooms were already in these areas. They were already being grown. In fact, they learned from local mushroom farmers. It's just that they weren't being grown by women-led farms. So this is the idea. And I want to loop back to what I was saying earlier during my time in Nepal, that there are studies that show there are great potential around mycofilters. That does not mean that these filters will be efficient or effective at filtering out the toxins that we see in different water systems around the world. And with that, we need to do more testing. I'm really excited for Trad to be here because I'm interested in him trying to update me a little bit more on the work he's been doing in Haiti. And I, again, am just re-entering this world and also recovering from the wildfire season, but really trying to see what other experiments have happened and what do we know and what else needs to be done to make it so that the mycofilter is not just a great idea that, well, these communities already don't have good drinking water, why not bring them here? No, they need to be effective and efficient. And they need to be something that, of course, we would drink out of. So more testing needs to happen with the mycofilter, as well as maintenance. In Tanzania, they would like to have a well by their farm so they can more easily upkeep the farm. In Zimbabwe, they'd like to expand their mushroom farm operations. So looking for the grants that don't just build, but also maintain these projects. And there's great possibility to bring this in across the world, as like Trad is already doing. But I also know, for at least for me, that these projects are working so well because I have this deep trust and relationship with the communities I'm working with. And with that, there's a question of, could I expand it past what is being done already? So with all of that, I'd like to thank you all again for being here today, and for any ideas or suggestions you might present in the coming question and answer session. And please feel free to reach out to me. And again, thank you, Sam and Cornelia, for contacting me in the first place.